Thanks very much one more time for your attendance. As I was putting this together, I kind of realized that I'm cueing you in some ways to be kind of skeptical from the jump with it. Anytime you hear, the 8 things to ... It's you should be very skeptical about that, right? The 8 keys to successful marriage, the 8 vacations you've got to do before you die. But this list of 8 has some rationale behind it, and it's got some research evidence behind it. And we've spent the last couple of years really trying to dig into the interplay between culture, the effectiveness, performance work that we do, and safety and risk, managing safety, managing risk in organizations, and try to understand from a culture perspective, what have we learned from the published research literature, from the accidents literature that does in-depth case studies of these events to try to understand what's going on and learn from them. And by the way, where industry is starting to try to regulate on this stuff. So nuclear came out with, it wasn't the 8 actually, it was the 9 for nuclear. There's a lot of overlap here, and we've looked at that. And petrochem is learning from that and adopting some of those same things. So be skeptical, not so skeptical that you leave in the next 20 minutes here. It starts with management. As we know, in culture, it starts with management. Managers have to wear the same hard hats as employees. Managers set the tone for this on a cultural level through actions. If they've had any kind of training, they say the right things, which is also important, but it's the action that sets the tone. The image with this one is these are the 33 miners that were trapped in the San Jose mine for 69 days when a diorite block, more than 14 stories high, shifted down across the tunnel that exits the mine. So when all the commotion stopped and people walked up to it from, the 33 walked up to it from down here, and the rescuers walked down here, what they saw was just a wall of shiny metallic substance that was completely blockading the tunnel, the route out. And there were a lot of things with this one where you look at management and you say, wow, what was going on here? How did this happen? But one of them that has to stick with you is that the chimneys that they had, which were the vertical hatches that connected the tunnel spaces to open air, weren't properly equipped with the ladders that were supposed to be in there. So they walked into that mine every day, managers and employees, knowing that if there was a collapse in that tunnel, there wasn't an alternative route out. The chimneys didn't have the ladders in them. And beyond that, just that one thing, how can you do anything after that to establish credibility on this issue? And you can't, and that translates. So when people are out making safety critical decisions, they have some frames of reference. They have, what would my manager think or do? What would my peers think or do? What have we done in the past? And the what would my manager think or do trumps all the others. And that's a research, rock-solid piece. That's the single most predictive item in a survey that we have from a diagnostic perspective that predicts safety and risk outcomes and how those are managed. Does my leader and manager actually care, truly care about my safety? Incredibly predictive. The other detail of this story, which is written up in a really great book called Deep Down Under, that stuck with me is that the managers at the mine actually wore white hard hats. Everybody else wore the yellow and wore the red. And you look at that and you say, to what degree do we need to magnify the power distance that's already here? Have you ever worked in a workplace where you didn't know who management was? No, we know that, but the thought of let's magnify that, pretty incredible one. And one of the reasons you don't want to magnify that, you actually want to shrink that power distance, and the symbolism matters quite a bit, is because of this reason, the speak up element. And if you followed this work, you know that speak-up culture has really gained a lot of momentum and a lot of evidence base behind the importance of it. Anybody recognize the magazine clipping here? And some of our aviation faces are no longer with us at this point. But anybody recognize this clip? This is Jacob van Zanten, was the chief pilot instructor for KLM, was the face of KLM for a number of years. This is actually a promotional clipping from a magazine, but one of the reasons that we use this one in the context of Speak Up is the collision of two Boeing 747s in 1977 in the Canary Islands, and you're probably familiar with this incident. It's to this day the deadliest civil aviation event that we've had. Over 500 people died in this one. And a lot of factors go into what happened. There was, they got rerouted, so both of these planes were not scheduled to land in the Canary Islands. They got rerouted because of actually a terrorist event at the original destination. As they were sitting there for multiple hours waiting to take off again, the dense fog sets in and the light dims. It gets into the afternoon and evening. You've got a Dutch pilot, for KLM. You've got Pan Am. And the air traffic control are Spaniards. So you've got language and accent gaps. So communication was really difficult. But one of the things that sticks with you from this one is the dialogue that contributes to this in the cockpit of the KLM 747. And so the first thing that happens is a quick exchange between the flight crew in Pan Am and the air traffic controller, and you can see that they're communicating about, tell us when you're clear, because both of the 747s are actually sitting on the runway facing each other, about to taxi out to take off. Tell us when you're clear. Thank you. We'll do that. In the KLM crew, misunderstanding that happens there, and the flight engineer, who's second in command to the captain, understands that Pan Am is not clear. But the way that he says this is he not clear? Is he not clear then? Question mark, a question. KLM captain, what do you say? So not much of, not the response you'd want. Is he not clear, that Pan American? Again saying, is that Pan American not off the runway yet? Oh yes. Implying, yes, he's clear, as the captain is accelerating the KLM up the runway directly into where the Pan Am is sitting and is not yet cleared. And you look at that, and again, it's one of a lot of things that collide to create this really horrific event. But you look at that and you think, wow, in these and this is about 13 seconds before the impact, and the way that there's a challenge is in the form of a question mark. And we know that at about 9 seconds, the two planes actually establish visual on each other, because in the Pan Am, the flight engineer is shouting and getting aggressive to try to do something. And in the KLM, it's silence for 13 seconds and then the impact. So what do you do to create that speak up where people feel like they can challenge if they need to? Well, you don't want the white hard hats and the yellow hard hats in there at all. As you think about organizations in complex environments, dealing with ambiguity, working through the unknown together, one of the images that comes to me, and I hope we don't have anyone phobic of insects in here. I haven't seen anyone too visibly do the heebie-jeebies about it. But the image that comes to me is an ant colony. That's a pretty good example of how to coordinate and how to organize. Ants have this figured out really, really well. There's actually a good YouTube one that shows an ant colony pulling a boa constrictor along the surface of the ground, just as ants. So it's quite incredible. But one of the things you see with that is how they close the boundaries between them. There's literally no physical space as they coordinate what they're doing. And it allows these micro communities that are totally meshed and have real-time information and real-time communication so that you don't see it as a set of individuals. You actually see the whole colony as an organism that morphs and adapts and does what it needs to do in order to do its thing. And you can learn from that in thinking about how you organize and how to reduce the functional boundaries that we create, the hierarchical boundaries that we create, all the stuff that's on the org chart that in a high-risk environment is clearly a part of the risk, and not even stopping on the internal boundaries, the internal-external. So, thinking about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, one of the things that's really fascinating about that is that of the 126 people that were on the deck of the Deepwater the day of the explosion, only 7 of those people were BP employees directly. The other 119 were contractors, BP working with about 8 contract agencies pretty closely to do what they were doing. So if you think that you don't have accountability, responsibility for coordinating across that internal-external boundary, you're deluding yourself. You do own that. And figuring out how to do that effectively in this context, critically important, critically important. The next one here, pay attention to your neck hairs. The workplace is a really interesting kind of place to observe human behavior because one of the things we do is pretty much train the emotional response out of people. It's not all that favorable to cry at work, to have emotional outbursts and reactions. That's not, authentic human behavior to put those things away. We've got the prefrontal cortex up here regulating the emotional response that the amygdala is firing off. And in most workplaces, that's okay because fear doesn't really need to be something that you're closely attuned to. In high hazard, though, that's one of the most important signals that you've got to read the environment, is the neck hairs, is the amygdala that you've trained to be quiet. And what's really interesting with this one is it really differs across industries quite a bit. What risk and danger looks like, very different depending on the context of the work. You can think about the ultra-safe industries like public transit, civil aviation, where really you want a pretty low threshold for what should trigger the amygdala, the signal, the fear response, because really danger shouldn't be a part, sure there's danger there, but it shouldn't be a part of the everyday management of operations. So you want a pretty low threshold. On the other end of the spectrum, think about Himalayan mountaineering. You remove the risk from that, you remove the occupation altogether. The risk is inherent, the danger is inherent in what you're doing. So in that context, it's not that you want to turn the amygdala off, it's that you have to learn what's a signal and what's noise, because there's so much noise in that environment. Okay? And if you're ascending K2, you got to figure that one out fast. About 1 in 4 people die doing the summit from the final camp to the summit of K2. The middle part of this is a lot harder to figure out. The high reliability space, and you can think petrochemical, you can think healthcare, you can think about space exploration, because the environment's really, really complicated to differentiate what is signal and what is noise. What do we need to be concerned by? So one of the things you figure out, particularly in that middle space, thinking petrochem as an example, is that you're reliant on the dialogue that you create, on the habits that you create around talking about risk. So as that guy's about to do his deep dive, is he getting information from the last girl in line that she tried that one previously and it was okay for her, she didn't hit a rock or have anything devastating happen, but she's only 4 foot tall and 110 pounds, and he's 6'3" and 200 pounds. So not all of the information we need. The next person in line, a little bit closer to 6 feet, but she didn't jump in exactly the same place at exactly the same way as they did. So all of these people bring, I don't know, this is the unscientific number in here, they bring about 5 or 10% understanding of their context to the situation. And the other 90% of the context, they're blind to. And it's only when we all kind of bring the 5 or 10% to the table and put it together that it really tells us something that informs the decision about whether or not to jump or to take the risk or to do whatever is next. So it's about that dialogue that you create in the organization and how you make sure that that's happening, because that's what you've got to rely on. Learn from the close calls. It's a pretty obvious point here that the stuff that almost kills you is something you might want to pause to learn quite a lot about to be able to prevent that going into the future. So that's not a shocker. Really difficult, though, for organizations to do that. How do they make that happen? They've got reporting systems for the things that do happen. We've got to comply on that level. So most organizations have that in place. Very few organizations have good systems in place for the stuff that almost got you. And it's difficult because people don't want to speak up about that stuff. So industries have gotten ahead of that, like aviation, where they've created anonymous reporting systems for near misses that give the person that's putting the report in, immunity toward any kind of action. We're not going to walk over and hit them with a stick for telling us about it. So it's very difficult. And then the other part of this is that we just don't really pick up on all the things that are near risks. A lot of us in this room may have had close calls we're not really ever aware of. Again, we've got 5 or 10% unscientific numbers of that context understanding. So how do you capture and get people to pay attention to the stuff that almost happens but didn't? It's very difficult, and there's got to be a clear effort there. 2, get to root causes, both in the context of the things that almost happen, the things that do happen. We're programmed to jump to the conclusion that involves, maybe 2 of the balls on the table, but doesn't involve the whole situation. There's moving parts, a lot of people, very complicated. And the other part that's very difficult to see is the role of time. Things degrade over time. From the moment that the tool, that the machine is fabricated and comes off the conveyor belt, it's degrading. It's at its peak and it's now degrading. And we can't see that. People are notoriously bad at seeing changes that unfold slowly over a long period of time. And that's a real part of that programming, the look in the rearview mirror to understand the role of all these complex things before we make decisions. The last one, I'm particularly passionate about. This is kind of, what the profession is about, studying the way that the work actually, emphasize the actually, gets done on the ground. Not the way that management thinks it ought to be, not the way it's written in the employee handbook, not the way that the IO psychologist job analysis says that it ought to be done, the way it actually happens day to day in the workplace. The example of this one that I've always hung on to since I heard it and looked at it involves a utilities company, shall remain nameless. About 20 years ago, went through a TQM process. So they looked very closely at quality and at processes. And one of the things that they quickly had to confront was that they were losing many, many more transformers than their competitors. So they had a blowout rate of 20, 25%, a lot higher than the industry standard, a lot higher than their competitors. And a light bulb goes off, eventually from the corporate. Let's send somebody out there, to sort of figure out ground level what's actually happening, what we're actually doing out there with it. And the process of installing the transformer has as a last step that you've got to ground it, right, to be resistant from lightning strikes. So you've got the rod, you've got the wire goes into the ground, it gets struck, it diffuses the electricity, you all know how that works. But one of the things in the industry that they do is that they test that installation to make sure that the grounding is appropriate, will be effective in the event of a lightning strike. And it turns out that it's actually fairly difficult to get one of these installations right. You might have to do it once and then discover that the ground composition isn't right there, dig it up, do it again. You might have to do it 3 or 4 times to get a ground that passes this diagnostic test. And what they discovered, as one of the guys from corporate comes out and studies it, after a period of really getting to know these guys well, he learns what's going on is that they're actually urinating on the wire. I apologize, a little bit crude example here. They're urinating on the wire prior to performing the test because it's conducive and it increases the likelihood that they pass the test. So if it's wet, if the wire's wet when they perform the test, it will pass the diagnostic. And of course, when the ground dries up, the grounding that you did wasn't actually an effective grounding, and you've got a transformer that blows out. So what's the point of that? The point is you've got to actually look really closely before you assume that the prescriptive version of what's supposed to happen is actually effective from the eyes of the people that are doing the work. And you've also got to understand the context that they're in. And in this case, these guys were incentivized. They had a quota for the number of them that they needed to do. So they figured out, these guys figure out the way to get it done and do it. And you can't manage it without understanding it. The last part of this, the most important part, thank you very much for the time. Really interested to have follow-on discussions with you about what we're doing, the work we've been doing with clients, and also to make you aware of the tools that we've created over this period of time that we're ready to launch with a benchmark at this point after having piloted them for the last year or so. So today's talk, a little bit of a teaser as to some of the components of what we've learned really matters in this context. And those components are what drives the tools that we use to measure some of this in organizations. And then hopefully to teach organizations what they can do about it. Because so much of this, as you all know, is about the mindset part of it. And these are things that are teachable to get people to change how they view. Thank you.
Awesome.